So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm located in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. As this is a virtual event, we are all located in different places. I invite you to acknowledge where you are located in the chat if you'd like to. We're going to begin the presentation, so please allow me to introduce our speaker, Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah. Debbie is the co-director of policy and advocacy at Action Canada for sexual health and rights. Before joining Action Canada, she was the executive director of the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity and has been instrumental in advocating for the rights of 2S LGBTQ plus youth and communities. She has spoken at parliamentary and Senate standing committees and has appeared in numerous media outlets. She's held several advocacy and policy-oriented positions in government and nonprofit organizations, including Oxfam Canada and Global Affairs Canada. Debbie is an accomplished community educator, feminist activist, and social justice advocate, driven by the mission of creating a more inclusive, equitable, and safe world. She has continued to dedicate her time to local progressive organizing, including most recently as a commissioner for the Ottawa People's Commission on the Convoy occupation. So I'm going to turn it over to Debbie now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Maria, for the welcome. And thank you, ARC, for holding this workshop. And thank you all of you for attending on a Saturday morning or afternoon, depending on where you are at. I am excited to be talking to you folks a little bit about doing advocacy and government relations at the provincial and territorial level. And so bear with me as I try to set up my PowerPoint presentation. One sec. Make sure that you folks can see. Ooh. Give me a sec. Can you see the PowerPoint? Excellent. And then if I switch to presenter view, can you still see just the PowerPoint? Excellent. So you can't see my notes. All right, nothing will be spoiled. Unfortunately, I cannot see all of you. Actually, hold on. No, I've adjusted it, so hopefully I'll be able to see most of you folks. But Maria, if anything comes up and I'm rambling and you need my attention, just unmute, and then that way I can stop and pay attention to you folks. Awesome. So, hi again, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah. I am the co-director of policy and advocacy at Action Canada for sexual health and rights. I've been working at Action Canada now since July of 2024, and prior to this role, as mentioned, I used to be the executive director of a national 2S LGBTQ youth organization. I've had policy and campaigner roles, and I've done some local feminist and anti-racist advocacy work in a variety of places. The convoy occupation is top of mind because the occupation was triggering. And so, if you ever want to talk about fighting fascism locally, that's a conversation I'd love to have with you folks, so we can get in touch and chat after. But I don't know how many of you folks are aware of Action Canada. And so what I'm hoping to do is just share a little bit about our work, who we are, and then I'm going to actually go into depth on some of our federal policy work. So just so that you folks can get an idea of what do we do at the national level before we go in and giving you some insights on what you folks can be doing at the provincial and territorial level. So for those who don't know about Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights is a national organization championing sexual and reproductive health and rights, both in Canada and around the world. And as the Planned Parenthood Federation of Canada, we work closely with a network of sexual health centers, I think one of them's in the room, who deliver care to communities across the country. And collectively, they serve hundreds and thousands of people in Canada, and our team at Action Canada runs programs that are used by thousands of people every year to connect to sexual and reproductive health services, specifically our Access line, which continues to support more and more people each year. I think right now we were about, just this last year, 6,500 callers. Half of that group of people called because they were facing major barriers to accessing abortion services. So that kind of shows where that overlap in the work that we do and with the work that ARC does comes together. With the work of our frontline services, that kind of gives us very invaluable insights into who does not and who does get the care that they need and what it looks like in real terms. And we use those insights to inform policy. So that's what I end up doing. I talk to our frontline team. So they showcase what trends and analysis is happening on the line. I take that and interpret it into policy, and then I go to politicians federally to tell them to get their shit together. It's actually a really fun part of my job. We also get to use those insights and our thought leadership on the issue to inform how we show up in coalition work. And that includes showing up here in terms of sharing insights on how you folks can build capacity in your advocacy work. And so just a quick overview of the agenda. There will be the presentation that I will be doing, which is the first I'm doing of this presentation, and I'll explain to you why this one's a little different later on. And in this session, we're going to do a breakout exercise that I'm calling Thinking Like a, and you folks will get to pretend and think like either an NDP politician, a conservative strategist, or a liberal in terms of really understanding what is it that they are thinking about as politicians, people who are motivated by politics to help inform your advocacy and government relations to get them to do stuff on abortion. And hopefully, if I do not run over time, there will be enough time for us to have a Q&A where you can ask me questions. And maybe I can ask you some questions because I'm also here to learn from you. You folks are seeing stuff at the local level that because Action Canada has more of that bird's eye view, we tend to always get in spaces like this. And so I'm hoping we can make this as reciprocal as possible. And yeah, I look forward to embarking in this learning exercise with you all. I did set out some learning objectives just to help with the flow of the conversation and to ensure that you folks are getting exactly what you need from this. And the first one is just for you folks to build an understanding of the difference between behind the scenes tactics. So that's that government relations. Sometimes it means putting on a blazer. Sometimes it means talking to someone you don't want to talk to. And then there's the public facing initiatives, which I think are the sexier part of advocacy. That is, that mobilizing of community, that's tabling, that's getting in front of the media. And we're also going to talk about when do you combine the two? When's the ideal time to combine both that behind the scene tactics and more of those front facing? The second objective is that I want you folks to be able to learn more about key decision makers at the provincial and territorial level and how to frame your advocacy ask strategically, because it may look a little different than how you would do it at the federal level. And then lastly, we're going to identify some practical ways to engage elected officials and policymakers, even including like, what do I even put in an email if I want to meet with them? I got your back. Awesome. So if folks are ready, we'll go right in to section one, which is around that understanding of the differences between behind the scenes and front-facing advocacy work. And before we get into the nitty-gritty, I kind of have to tell you folks a little bit about what advocacy actually is. So advocacy is about taking action to create change, and it can be any change. And that's change that's aimed at the state or government to enact law and policy change. It can also be used to transform social norms and foster supportive context for policy implementation. In the context of our work in sexual and reproductive health and rights, advocacy is key to upholding our rights to accessing adequate and accessible sexual health care. It leads to long-term policy and legal reforms that are, of course, essential for human rights. And it's advocacy that's critical in fighting back to the far right and other counter-regressive movements that are here to destroy the things that we fought so hard for. At the most affected by SRHR context, we have our feminist movements that are here, that are the drivers of progress, accountability, they're people-centered, etc. And for us at Action Canada, we cannot do this advocacy work in isolation. We do it in coalitions, we do it in partnerships, and globally in the fight for reproductive and sexual health. We do so in transnational alliances. And we understand that feminist movements and the demands that they put are what are key for us to ensuring that sexual and reproductive health and rights are included in the broader spectrum of universal human rights. Really quickly, why SRHR advocacy in particular is important. So this advocacy work that keeps us going, that has us here on a Saturday talking about advocacy work. Well, we know that SRHR needs to be priority. SRHR needs and issues are often stigmatized. They still are. And I'm speaking to the choir here, and we know exactly why that is. The stigma, unfortunately, is often what leads to these issues being deprioritized by governments and decision makers. And so it's our advocacy work that ensures that it is still top of mind. So you might see me on a few social media accounts for Action Canada talking about contraception access. That is a big piece of what we're doing federally, because at a time where we're facing austerity with a very conservative liberal government, if we all of a sudden are just like, no, we'll be fine. We don't need to talk about contraception access. Pharmacare still passed. Let me tell you something. These people do not want it to be a priority because it would be cheaper for them not to care about it and to not to fund it. We only have 4 deals in regards to provincial governments and territorial governments. That's 9 more we need to sign. And if we're quiet about it, best believe they would put it under the rug and make sure that, I don't know, our military has all the money. So that's why that's important. We also know that this advocacy work is important is because it leads to change. Advocacy that engages from the local to the national and to international levels is required to galvanize and sustain political and normative change. It is our advocacy work in this field that facilitates and connects change at all these levels. We also know that this advocacy work addresses the root causes. It is not surface level. It's advocacy work that's grassroots and feminist that identifies and challenges systemic barriers to sexual and reproductive health and rights and helps to make sure that it is sustainable long term. And lastly, our advocacy work supports a vibrant and active civil society. It's civil society organizations, many of the ones who are represented here, that defend collective interests and increase accountability, promote participation from different communities, directly engage in community service, and challenge prejudice. And for a free and pluralistic civil society to flourish in our democracy, it needs to also be well funded. So again, at the federal level, that's something I yell at the government about. Something that you folks could also be doing provincially and territorially, which I know many of you folks are doing. And so I'm going to go through this really quickly. I only put this in here because sometimes we get questions about like, how does Action Canada do it? And all that, although this presentation is kind of set up to give you some like basic insight into it, some folks always have questions about like, what's happening behind the scenes? And I just put this here so that you can get an idea of all of the different pillars of our work. We do global and domestic advocacy. As mentioned, I'm a co-director. So my colleague Meg, who's based in Nova Scotia, she leads our global advocacy file, and I handle our domestic advocacy file, which is why it is me who's presenting this and not her. We also have our frontline services that I mentioned earlier that helps inform our policy work. We do a lot of knowledge mobilization, and there's collaboration and movement building. But the big piece for us in this work is that partnerships are key. So we are part of several coalitions. And one that we're actually really, really proud of is the work that we do with our research partners at the University of British Columbia, CART, which is the Contraception Access and Abortion Research Team. They're fantastic because they give us the receipts to tell politicians what is actually up when it comes to SRHR access. And so I put this here just so that you can get a really quick summary, but if there are any details around what do we do, please let me know. And I've shared this here because our policy team and our advocacy team works super, super closely with our Department of Health Promotion. And that department is the department that has our folks working on the access line and our abortion fund. And this is actually a policy brief specifically on the work that they do on the line, which is really incredible. And so I just wanted to share this as another example of how that collaboration happens internally that informs our broader work. And then again, another really, really quick overview of some of the pillars of our policy work. So that way you folks understand like what are the core policy issues that Action Canada is working on. They're here. It's safe abortion care, comprehensive contraception care, advocacy for SRHR, and then adolescent SRHR, which includes comprehensive sex education. So without further ado, and enough about Action Canada, let's talk about advocacy at both the national and provincial level. So on our side, we work on SRHR in Canada. And of course, because it's healthcare related, navigating jurisdiction happens to be a thing that we deal with all the time. So much so that when we do try to talk to the federal government about moving certain areas forward, i.e. contraception access, so much of it that we get back is, it's the provinces. And we get it. Our Canadian Health Act is held federally. That's where the funding flows to the provinces and territories, but it's the provinces and territories that are implementing the Canadian Health Act through the expenditures of healthcare transfers from the feds. And so, what you folks need to know is who to advocate to and for what. For us, because we focus federally and we do so utilizing many of our tools and our advocacy knowledge, we realize in order for us to really do this work, we cannot just hold all of the policy and government relations work federally. That needs to be shared, and we need to build the capacity of folks like you to be able to go to your premiers to tell them to actually use the funding they are giving federally to make a difference on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And so that's why we do this coalition work. That's why we're here today to work with you folks and to give you some insights, to share these tools so that you folks can do so with your own grassroots organizations locally, but also in collaboration with us because we can't do it alone. So I'm going to bring it back to grade 10 civics. I don't know, for folks in Ontario, we did civics. I don't know for other provinces, but it was essentially like how does the government run? I have this slide here just to give you folks some insight on Canada's three levels of government. Of course, we have federal, provincial, and territorial. And here listed are just some of the things that each of those levels of governments oversee. Other elements of governance in Canada, of course, includes First Nation governance. So across the country, we have band councils who govern First Nations. And these band councils are similar to municipal governments, but band members elect the band council, which makes decisions that affect their local community. So again, if you're working directly with Indigenous groups or in collaboration, this is something for you folks to consider about the local advocacy work on that end. And of course, in our parliamentary democracy, there are three parts to it. We have the king, we also have our Senate, and we have our House of Commons. And in this country, it's Canadian citizens who elect political representatives at all three levels. And these elected representatives hold positions in City Council, the Federal House of Commons, and then as well in provincial and territorial legislatures. And they have the job of passing laws, approving and monitoring spending, and keeping the government accountable. And I just put this in here just to show you that know what two provinces well, not all of them use the same name to describe or title to describe their elected representatives. So it's just interesting to see it mapped out this way. So I put it on here in case folks were curious why in Ontario we talk about MPPs and why in Alberta they talk about MLAs. But what is that difference between like advocacy, the thing that we often use, and then lobbying, which is also a big part of us advocating for SRHR? Well, there are compliance obligations that we have. When it comes to engaging all levels of government, advocates should be familiar with legal compliance issues related to lobbying. And there is a different obligation related to lobbying in different jurisdictions. There's the Lobbying Act. So for Action Canada, there are certain rules that we need to abide by. And in provinces and territories, that will look differently as well. Advocacy writ large is that general education and public awareness efforts, such as running a public-facing advocacy campaign. And the lobbying is the direct engagement with policymakers to influence legislation and decision making. And they tend to come together often, as they should, in order for us to advance many of our causes, including abortion access. One thing to keep in mind, and this is as you folks are really starting to think about either a local particular issue, abortion access directly, or anything related to SRHR, you want to consider an environmental scan in your partnerships because this will let you know, are you starting from scratch or are you building on something that has already existed? As I think the recipients of the benefits of some fantastic feminist activism over the last few decades in this country, we know we are not starting from scratch in the fight for strong and equitable abortion access, but there may be unique things in your local context that may require you to look to see, has someone worked on this before? Is there a partnership that might strengthen things? These are the things that you want to consider before you take charge on a particular advocacy issue and before you bring it to decision makers, because it means that you might be able to bring some friends along the way with you. So, talked a little bit about those differences on lobbying versus government relations. But what is really key is to understand when those two get paired and the context of which they get paired. Of course, as mentioned, there are the behind the scenes pieces. So these are the private meetings, these are policy recommendations, and this is advisory work. Depending on where you're located in the country, the political context, or even just the capacity of some of the decision makers in your respective region may require you to put a little bit more effort in the behind the scenes pieces. It also might just be a little bit more strategic to be quieter behind the scenes on certain things and to move things along without the fanfare, as opposed to the more loud public facing approach. And you will just need to determine when is that going to be most strategic for you. In my opinion, all of these elements have to come into play, the combination of the two, but you may need to lean more in some areas than others in order to move your cause ahead. The public facing campaigns may be something that we're all, of course, very familiar with. That's that media advocacy, that's petitions, that's social media engagement, that's protest. Again, the sexy things. I think they're fun. That is a big piece of us getting this work going forward. One part where you combine both those like behind the scene efforts and public facing efforts, in my opinion, if you want to be a little bit of a shit disturber when you're engaging these decision makers, if those private meetings stall for whatever reason, if you folks have been making progress on something that you have decided because you took a scan of the strategic context for you, but they're stalling, you can apply the pressure, and you should apply the pressure publicly to increase urgency. And one example of this, and in a tool that I'm going to tell you about later in the presentation, Access BC on the pharmacare piece was really good at being able to apply pressure when they determined that the behind the scenes conversations were not moving urgently enough. And so that is usually a key piece where both come together in a very loud way, is when you want to apply pressure to decision makers. But many of you are activists and advocates. So this is not surprisingly new, but it's something to reiterate to help give you the confidence to know when you can straddle using all these different tactics to make sure abortion access is strong in this country. So section 2, we're going to talk about key decision makers at the provincial and territorial level and how to frame our advocacy asks strategically. Alrighty. So here are who these key people are and why we got to talk to them in order to make sure health access in this country is where it needs to be. We have the premier and its cabinet ministers. We have opposition leaders and critics. We have provincial and territorial party offices. We also have our local representatives. So that whole list of all the fancy names, your MLAs, MNAs, MPPs, and MHAs, these are the folks that you want to engage with locally to get things moving. For your premier and your cabinet ministers, they are, of course, responsible for setting government priorities and policies. Some premiers and cabinet ministers provincially are really good at making their priorities national news. I'm not going to call any provinces out, might be out west, no shade. That being said, the Minister of Health, which all of our provinces have, or your Minister of Women and Gender Equality, if applicable, some governments have something that's similar to that, may be the key context for you when it comes to SRHR issues. Engaging with the relevant minister rather than the premier themselves should probably be your main priority. Ministers are going to be a little bit more reachable than the premier. However, if you have a reason to believe that the premier is likely to be a champion of your cause, then it may be worth trying to engage them. Prime example would be in Manitoba around contraception access. Not only does Premier Wab Kinew made contraception access a very top priority, by virtue of having a deputy premier who is a nurse and also the Minister of Health, we saw what that engagement looked like. They worked with one of our partners, which is a sexual health center in Winnipeg. And there was a lot of fanfare when contraception not only was made official in that province under their own realm, but also when they signed a deal with the federal government. Then we have our opposition party leaders and our critics. Opposition parties play a crucial role in challenging government policies and can push for changes in legislation or funding commitments. Opposition critics are often referred to as shadow ministers, so you can reach out to the staff of your opposition parties, including both staff supporting leaders or the critics. So again, similarly, is there a critic for health in your respective province that you know would be a good champion? Become besties with them. Give them what they need to be annoying in question period in your respective legislature, because that's how we end up moving things along. I will acknowledge, and I think in our exercise this may come up, in some provinces, the oppositions are pretty weak. In some of our provinces, the current party in play has a very, very strong majority. And as a result, it may require a little bit more effort in terms of engaging that opposition party, but it is still worth it to do so. And we can see how things are moving. Prime example would be in Nova Scotia. The opposition party there is relatively small, but has shared values, and as a result of it, has made it really easy to engage with advocates working on contraception. And that party has also started to incorporate that in their messaging and trying to ask the province, what are you doing with that money that the federal government has committed to ensure that people in the province get the medication they need? There's the provincial and territorial party offices. So engaging with the party staff can help influence party stances. It's also particularly important in the lead up to an election, as it could actually help influence political platforms. And then lastly, your local representatives. These are your MLAs, your MNAs, your MPPs, your MHAs, including the ones that you probably think are annoying. But them, contacting your local representative is an asset because they are able to raise issues in the legislature, introduce motions, or support local advocacy campaigns. And again, very similarly, if they are in opposition, they can actually ask questions about your issue in government during question period. A cool thing too is by virtue of you being a constituent of theirs, either individually or if you are representing an organization, and by virtue of the address of that organization, that MP happens to be your MP, you are their constituent. They have to talk to you. So don't hesitate to use where you live to your advantage to get your local representative to talk to you about the issues that matter. So now we know who the people are. We also need to consider what they want to hear. And politicians are interesting people. And so here's some things that you want to consider when it comes to engaging policy makers and framing the issues that we work on in a way that'll actually make them listen. So you want to consider mandate letters. You also want to consider evidence-based advocacy, oops, and you want to also consider public and political support. Mandate letters. Mandate letters is a common thing that folks will hear federally. Under Justin Trudeau, mandate letters had a lot of fanfare around them. Each minister got their own carefully crafted mandate letter, which made advocacy a little easier because we knew exactly what the Prime Minister was telling the Minister of Health or Minister of Women and Gender Equality what to do on issue X. Interestingly enough, with the Carney Liberal government, there's only one mandate letter for every minister. It's a different change, but it also lets you know what it is that helps motivate or make this government move. Across Canada, ministers do receive them, outlining their priorities. And aligning your advocacy with their priorities is going to actually increase the likelihood of engagement. So if your province or territory actually has mandate letters, which you can probably find online, there is an example that I'm happy to share of, from the BC government. But not every province or territory has made these mandate letters public, and that decision solely rests on the premier and cabinet. Living in Little Ontario, Doug Ford didn't think it was necessary to publicize mandate letters for the minister or the cabinet ministers who he gave recently a significant raise. So that is something that's been interesting as trying to navigate that in this province, but you might be lucky with a government who believes in accountability. There's also the evidence-based advocacy. So policymakers, so these are your public servants at the provincial or territorial level. They are likely to act if you provide credible data, expert opinion, and real-life stories demonstrating your impact on the issue. So you want to combine narrative, the storytelling piece, with the data to provide a factual and emotionally compelling argument. And then lastly, there's the public and political support. If there is a public demand for a policy change, politicians may be more willing to act. Thus, you want to create a public groundswell of support for your cause. So this is again where those two combine, the behind the scenes and the public facing. This is where your campaigns, media coverage, petitions, letter writing efforts, and rallies can really strengthen your advocacy efforts. One thing I just wanted to flag too, and a big piece of my job federally is doing landscape monitoring on SRHR. That means I spend a lot of time reading what comes out of each department that is relevant to Action Canada's work. So that's Health Canada, that's the Department of Women and Gender Equality, the Prime Minister's Office, Finance, et cetera, et cetera. Really just tracking what are they saying in the House, what are they saying in publications, what is their next move? Because this gives you folks insight on potential policy changes on the area of healthcare, sexual reproductive health, and also abortion access. So I encourage you all, if you really want to nerd out, to sign up for government newsletters and party press releases because it's going to tell you everything you need to know about what your respective decision maker is thinking. You can also do Google alerts on key issues. And if you have access to it, there's media monitoring tools that you could also use to find out what they're working on. One thing you also want to make sure you have well ahead of time is a clear identification of your advocacy objective and to be able to create your message. And so what we have here that I'm showing you is a template for an advocacy brief, which is accessible to all of you, so you folks can all use this. Basically, before you engage with a policy maker, you want to define your advocacy objective, and which is what exactly you want to change. So these are just some basic questions that we have on this slide here for you to think about. What is the specific policy, legislation, or funding change you're seeking? Who has the power to make that change? And what is the clearest, most strategic way to frame your request? Using an advocacy brief and actually outlining it, maybe run it through Canva, put it on a pretty template. This ends up being a document that you not only share with decision makers if you do have meetings with them, but it's also a document that you can share with people in community who are also curious about the issue that you're trying to advance and want to know, based off your expertise, how best to position it when they're talking to their neighbors, their local representative, etc. There's also tips and tricks on how to make sure your message, including your message to the public, is persuasive as much as possible. And this has been something that Action Canada has been really working on hard to increase our ability to formulate persuasive messaging. And so there's a tool for that as well, and a training that we would love to share with you folks as you're starting to think about your campaign development and persuasive messaging. And so real quick snapshot on this sheet, some things that you folks want to think about are the following. When you're building persuasive messaging, you want to open with shared values to welcome people in across the political spectrum. Again, some of us are doing this work in provinces that are conservative. Let's be for real. And so we really need to figure out, how can I talk about abortion access? How can I talk about SRHR to a government who may not be aligned? Doesn't mean that we stop the effort because politically they're not in alignment with us. We still need to do this work. It is our duty in a democracy. We just need to, tweak things around with how we do so. So this tool here gives you some insight on doing that. Other things to think about as you're developing persuasive messaging: introduce the problems clearly and simply, present the solution with a vision of change, and to conclude with a call to action. So we'll talk a little bit more about this tool and where you can find it later on. Oftentimes, when people are asking us or me about advocacy tips and how best to present things to decision makers, they're like, how do I know when's the best time to, talk to a decision maker? I don't know when. I'm afraid because I'm not aware of things. And it's just like, well, you can find the right time based on history because governments often run on a very predictable scheduling, and there are some key engagement windows that you can take advantage of to be able to get your issue on the table, or at least make it a big piece of your strategy going forward. And so Here we have a list of like what those engagement opportunities are, and I'll break them down a little as I go through them. First, provincial and territorial elections. If you're in Newfoundland, you have an election coming up in a couple of weeks. You have your provincial and territorial budgets. There's government strategies and consultations. There's provincial and territorial minister meetings. This is where we can collaborate a little bit on that one. And then there's federal funding and committee meetings. When it comes to provincial and territorial elections, there are actually like three kind of sub times when you can engage your local representatives. There's pre-election. If you are able to advocate for SRHR policies to be included in party platforms, folks, that is like the one of the most successful things. Because even if a government is 1 year, 2 year, 3 years into their mandate, or even an opposition party, what they run on is often the thing that they are held accountable for. On the federal level, the amount of times we've heard opposition parties say, the prime minister said he was going to run on elbows up and the elbows are down because he did this with tariffs. That is actually used as something to hit the party in power with. And so if you can get issues on there, it allows you to hold that government accountable, whether they are successful in implementing something or not. So that's something to consider. During the elections, you want to be able to engage both local candidates and provincial and territorial leaders and parties to ask their positions. And you want to use the election window to maybe launch a campaign to mobilize the public and to get some political support for your issue. Elections tend to be the time where most people are paying the attention to politics. Not everyone is like myself watching federal question period every day, but they might be interested in politics when they know that there's an election coming up in a couple of weeks. This is a great time to grab people's attention. There's also the post-election, following up with the winning party to ensure that the campaign promises are implemented. Did they talk about healthcare? I think they may have. It's provinces. This is where you hold them accountable. And you can ask them for something to be included in mandate letters because mandate letters often get crafted and presented to cabinet once the cabinet is selected. And for the jurisdictions that actually have public mandate letters, you can then hold the ministers accountable to fulfilling their mandates. So start early by engaging in elections. Budgets are also a major opportunity for advocacy, but you have to engage at the right time. And this is usually months ahead of a budget being tabled if you're going to advocate for SRHR funding. So provinces and territories usually have a formal pre-budget engagement process, which includes surveys and consultations, which are often in full swing months before the budget is even revealed. In some jurisdictions, you might be able to submit a written brief to a committee. And the guidance here is also going to be applied to fall economic statements. So that's usually an update that your respective Minister of Finance will do on the province's financial structure or financial picture. So this is an opportunity to do that as well. Action Canada has been deeply engaged on the budget process federally for the budget that's going to be announced in November. I have a deep sigh for many reasons, and austerity is the big one, but this is just an example of what we've been doing. We engage months in advance, and it allows us to hold the government accountable on its spending. There are also government strategies and consultations that may take place. And so certain governments may have to create a policy strategy on a certain issue or area. So on health, gender equality, or other issues. So for example, Manitoba's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Two-Spirit Plus strategy, which is also known as the All Women Doing Well. While this strategy is being developed, it's actually a great time to engage with governments during public consultations to make your vision, your strategies, and your community's needs heard. And there are opportunities for both the public-facing side of the advocacy and the behind-the-scenes advocacy, usually when these strategies are being developed. If you're in Alberta, maybe the Alberta First panels trying to determine what type of future people want for Alberta and Canada's federation could be an opportunity to do some advocacy work on SRHR. It may not seem like it, but where your province is getting money from the feds and how that is being spent, that's a clear thing that needs to be discussed by a table that's talking about sovereignty, right? So that's something to consider. For provincial and territorial minister meetings, this usually happens, these PT meetings, when all ministers, provincial, territorial, and federal, meet on a certain issue altogether to discuss key priorities. An example is the PT meetings for health. So there's one coming up in October. So our federal minister of health is going to meet with all of her health minister counterparts. And this is a great opportunity to talk to them before so that you can influence these discussions. So while I am going to talk to Minister Michelle about, healthcare, abortion access, and contraception, be a great opportunity for you folks to do so with your respective ministers of health. If we're saying the same thing, it will allow those issues to be presented to the table. And then lastly, there are federal funding and committee meetings that you can also use to take advantage of to discuss issues in greater depth and length. And you can actually learn about these committees on your respective government websites. So is there a committee on health? Is there a committee on status of women? We have it federally. Your province might have something similarly. That's something that you can also take advantage of because whoever's on that committee, and usually it's representation of all of the parties, developing relationships with those people will help determine if whether a particular study is brought up, who can be a witness when a study is being discussed. These are the things that you want to be primed to be able to do, because one thing I will let you know, especially for these committee meetings, our opposition goes to these. They are monitoring when is the time to go up in there to speak. I'm going to say the word, their nonsense. And we also need to be primed to either be there or be able to influence who gets invited to share their insights so that we're advocating for the right stuff, folks. Last section before we go into the breakout, and I'm keeping an eye on time. I'm going to move really, really quickly. Section 3, we're going to talk about practical ways to engage elected officials or policymakers. So, how to book a meeting with a policymaker. Here, I have information on how exactly you find one, the email of your local representative. It'll be on government websites usually. If you go on the respective party websites, you might also be able to find contact information relating to the party itself. So, again, election influencing, this is a great time. Policymakers might be a little tricky. So this might be, the director general or a senior policy advisor in health who oversees quote unquote women's health issues or sexual and reproductive health and rights. You might need to do a little bit more sleuthing, but this is where coalition building comes in. If another organization had successfully had conversations with maybe someone within, I don't know, say the Minister of Education's department, try to share some information so then that way you'll know exactly who to contact. I don't know how well this is presented on your screen, and this is something that you'll be able to access after this meeting, but this is actually a sample email of how to request a meeting. For some people, they don't know where to start, they're scared, and it's okay. There's a template for that, and it's here in English as well in French, so that you can plug it in with the respective information of your advocacy group or your organization to request the meeting with the decision maker that you're looking to engage. And something to consider about preparing for a meeting. You want to make sure that you have this like little checklist of things ready to go to make sure that that meeting or engagement with that decision maker goes as well as possible. So to prepare, to make sure that your efforts are where they need to be, where you're going to get the best outcome, develop an advocacy brief. That brief that I showed you earlier, that I have a screenshot here on this screen. You want to make sure that it's there because it's going to serve as a summary of your issues and your asks during that meeting. And if it will help you be strategic and can also be given to an official after your meeting. And so in that brief, also outlined in this template, you want a one-page summary of your issue. You want data and evidence supporting your ask. You want a motivation on why it is aligned with the government, or if applicable, the opposition party's interests, because you would have done that research already. And you want a clear call to action, but you also want that call to action to be specific to that person. If this is the opposition critic on women and gender equality in British Columbia, you want that MLA to have to clearly identify the opportunities they have. If that MLA sits on a committee, tell them that they need to bring this to the health committee that they sit on. they need to ask these questions within question period. They also need to bring this to their party leader. Like you can be as specific because you would have done the research about this person and know exactly where they can bring that information to move things forward. You also want to prepare your elevator pitch. So meetings with elected officials can be very short, very fast-paced. And so preparing an elevator pitch is going to help you get your point across. That persuasive messaging template that I talked about or tool that we have, this will help you give some insight onto like how exactly you want to be able to get that pitch going really quickly. And you'll notice the more you practice it, the easier it is going to be for you to be able to speak to anyone about the issue that you're advocating for. Another key thing, bring constituents to your meeting. Please bring them. Just last week, Action Canada had our National Youth Board join us for a lobby week. And because of the lovely addresses of those youth, we were able to score a meeting with Prime Minister Carney's Parliamentary Secretary, Cody Blois, who is a Nova Scotia MP. And it was because of us having a member who happens to be from that riding. That is the closest we have been to someone advising the prime minister since this government change, which is a complete 180 when Justin Trudeau's prime minister office was rolling the red carpet to hear from organizations like Action Canada and other women's rights organizations. So bringing constituents might actually help you secure a meeting, but it also allows those elected officials to hear from people who are they locally represent. And you want to anticipate questions and rebuttals. If you're going to talk to a particular party who may not originally be aligned, be prepared to have questions asked of you and to be able to respond to them in a way that is still going to get your point across, but is held firm and, of course, is aligned with your values. I have spoken a lot, and I've been trying to do so in less than an hour. If we're good with this, I'm going to throw this back to Joyce and Maria because we're going to go into our breakout session. And I wanted to explain the breakout session to you folks really quickly, and then we'll move around and get you folks to start thinking about everything I just dumped on you for the last 50 minutes or so. And then we're going to come back and report back. And so this breakout session, I'm calling Think Like a. And this is an opportunity for you folks to really start thinking about your decision makers, who they are, and what actually motivates them. When we're engaging with decision makers, it's super important to frame our advocacy ask in a way that aligns with their priorities and mandates. But when we do this with politicians, it's important to note they are motivated by one thing, and that is to win. And it's the politics that motivates them to move on certain policy issues. So when it comes to this, we are going to do this exercise that was actually recently introduced to the Action Canada team. And it's a good exercise to help you start to think like a politician. For some people, that might be gross, but also for you to help develop a good lobby strategy that will hopefully align with your broader advocacy work. And so we're going to break out into groups that'll be handled by the ARC team. But what I want you to think about, and this is where I might need some help where people like pick which one. Actually, you know what? Depending on your group, you will be able to choose who you want to be. You can be an NDP premier, you can be a liberal health minister, or you can be a provincial conservative strategist. And you need to answer the following questions, and they can be brief. What are the top priorities of this premier, the minister of health, or the strategist? What are their constraints? What's actually limiting their action to particularly move in a particular area? And abortion. What does that particular person actually think about this topic? And lastly, what keeps them up at night? This is an interesting exercise because it'll let you know just realistically how they are going to move when it comes to abortion access based on where they are at politically. So this will, of course, require you folks to have some basic knowledge on how an NDP provincial government operates, a liberal provincial government, there's not a lot of them, or a conservative government or strategist. So let's have some creativity in you folks thinking about this. You get to pick which one your group will be, and then you'll report back really quickly going over these 4 questions. How does that sound? So I'll throw it to you, Maria and Joyce, so we can get the breakout session started. Again, thank you for indulging on this exercise. These are actually really key questions for you to think about, especially as you're developing strategy for whoever you're going to be speaking to. Especially the question on what do they think about abortion? Because for many of the conservative politicians, it is a abortion or SRHR writ large is a very convenient wedge where it could work for them or not, depending on the context. And I think this is where, again, the uniqueness of having all of us representing different parts of the country, you can see where the wedge comes in and out. And I think it was Ray who talked about comprehensive sex ed in Ontario. This is why, especially in our work at Action Canada, we do a lot to mention what's happening with 2S LGBTQ issues. We're monitoring what provinces are doing on 2S LGBTQ rights because that is a pathway to restrict abortion access. And I want folks who do this work to think about it because they test the ability to limit rights with a group that people are like still unsure about, even though they know that attacking abortion outright may be unpopular. They still need to feed that part of the base. So how are they doing so? So these are an exercise for you folks to think about as you go back to your respective grassroots groups or organizations to do this, to think like this. But also don't be afraid to do the same thing for an NDP or liberal politician because they too have constraints dependent on their voter coalition. BC is an interesting one because they narrowly squeezed a majority. It would be interesting to see that same exercise with some of the BC folks in here. That being said, I'm going to share my screen again real quick so that I can conclude and get to us talking about some questions here. So just give me one sec. Bear with me. Excellent. So, in conclusion, folks, advocating for SRHR at the provincial and territorial levels requires strategic engagement, strong messaging, and persistence. So, by using the tools and strategies that I've shared with you, and I will share more, the local organizations can influence policy and create meaningful change. And if you need further guidance, Action Canada is here to help you. And I mean it, like even myself, it's my job, but I also love doing this to be able to share ideas and tips and tricks on like how do we continue to build a strong movement for the protection of SRHR at a time where our opposition is the most resourced that they've ever been. And so I talked about a few tools that Action Canada has been working on, but we've developed a suite of new tools and training, including this one, to help build the capacity of many folks like yourselves to do this work. There is an entire advocacy toolkit that may or may not include many of the things I shared here today that is solely focused on your ability to do this work at the provincial and territorial level. There's the persuasive messaging document that I mentioned. There's the advocacy brief. There's also a how to talk to the media guide that we have created. And so you'll see going forward that Action Canada will be doing training like this going more. Our team is actually going to be at Abortion Cares Canada's conference in a couple of weeks, and my communications colleague Quinn is going to be doing a messaging and media training. So if you folks are going to be at that conference, you'll get to hear from them directly. And so partner with us. This last slide here talks about, other ways that we can work together with you to build a very strong movement. And so reach out to me. You can either reach out directly to the info at email or Joyce, maybe after you can share my contact details with folks so we can stay in contact. Otherwise, thank you so much for being a part of this session and dealing with my light adjusting the way it has been. I don't know, it's been annoying me. My apologies. I'm on my work laptop. And yeah, I'll open it up to Q&A. Maria, I'll ask you to come in just to help with facilitating the Q&A if there were any questions in the chat, knowing that we don't have too much time. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Debbie. This was such an insightful presentation and so engaging. So thank you for your time.